and then completed her dietetic internship at University of Houston, which included interning with the UH athletic teams. Following passing her RD exam, she worked for 2 years specializing in eating disorders and currently is the campus dietitian at UWGB and assisting UWGB athletics as well. She is a past collegiate athlete as a cross-country runner and currently coaches soccer in her free time, which I like because I do too. And then also we have Marissa Spatz, who's graduated from UWGB with an undergraduate degree in human biology with nutrition and exercise science emphasis. She's currently in the Masters of Nutrition Integrated Health program at UWGB and is a current intern for us at Prevea Health and UWGB Athletics. In her free time, she enjoys walks, baking, and spending time with family, which is awesome. Tonight's topic, again, as we talked about, is nutrition made easy for runners. So these two will take it from here, discussing the how and when and why and all the good things about fueling our bodies with running and with hopefully food. I'm getting hungry right now, but I'm going to turn it over to Kirsten and Marissa. Take it away.
Awesome. Well, I will share my screen, but thank you all for joining. Let's go ahead. Marissa and I will be sort of tag teaming this throughout. And then if there are questions, just feel free to put them in the comments and we'll answer them towards the end. We're planning to try to keep about 10 to 15 minutes at the end to answer any questions. So hopefully that is being shared. Marissa, can you give me a thumbs up if that's good?
Yep, I can see it.
Okay. Awesome. All right, so we will go ahead and get started. So yes, like Mike was just explaining, nutrition made easy for long distance running. All right,
So just a quick outline of what we're going to talk about this evening. We'll start out with just a little introduction and some basics of nutrition. And then we'll go into talking about the loading phase or pre-competition, how to fuel during races or training, and then how to use nutrition to support recovery. We'll talk about a few nuances in running and nutrition, and then we'll leave some time at the end for questions.
awesome. So I think it's really important to start out by just asking a question like, why does nutrition even matter? So one big thing that I think can just put this into perspective, when you're moving your body, it means you need to use energy to do that. So our form of energy, it comes in the form of calories. There's a lot of talk out there about calories, but when you break it down, it is just a measurement of energy. So when you're running, maybe it's a half marathon or a marathon, you can use up to 1,200 calories for a half marathon or more. And for full marathons, 2,400 calories or more. That just puts into perspective of how much energy, how much calories, how much food you need to fuel for your races. That also goes into not just race day, but also all the training, all the preparation that leads up to it as well. So another key part is what happens if you're not fueling efficiently or sufficiently. So some of the different things that can happen is increased risk of injury, which obviously if you're a runner, that's not too fun because then you're going to have to stop running for a bit. So fueling your body correctly can really reduce that injury risk to keep you running. Then the other one is inability to complete the race. So with long distance running, it's not just about our physical health, but also like that mental health of being able to just keep going for that long of a race. And actually, we'll sort of talk about it a little bit as we move on, but food also helps our brain to sort of keep that mental fatigue from coming too quickly. Also, we can see poor performance if we're not fueling adequately, increased physical and mental fatigue, like I just mentioned, increased GI upset. So that's a really big one for runners is GI issues when running before or after or during. So food, different techniques with food can help mitigate that. Then also dehydration as well as overhydration, which isn't talked about as much, but still a concern that we'll sort of address as we move along. Okay, so just to break it down really into those basics, there's three main sources of energy that our body uses. And as an athlete, as a runner, your main source is going to be carbohydrates. And when you really break this down, carbohydrates are simply sugar. So there's a lot of talk out there about carbohydrates always. And in all honesty, when your body is using it for energy, it doesn't matter. Our body doesn't even know if this is coming from a piece of whole wheat bread or a piece of candy. They all break down into essentially glucose to fuel our body. That's just one big thing to keep in mind. I come from a place of all foods have a place in your like sort of diet, and just following all moderation and that sort of thing. So carbohydrates are our number one source of fuel, not just for our muscles, but also for our liver glycogen, which fuels our brain. So that's what I was talking about with the mental fatigue. If you feel like you just can't get through your races, it might be because we're not storing enough of that sugar earlier on in the day to help fuel our brain through it. All right. Second most or secondary like source of energy. So like I said, carbohydrates are the first one for runners. We also will use fats because especially longer races, or if you're doing anything at a slower pace, fats will be our secondary source of energy. So still very important, but maybe not as important as focusing on those carbohydrates. Finally, we have protein. This is one that's pretty big with athletes. We've all heard of protein helping build muscles and all of that. I like to really put it into a framework of think of what your body needs is sort of like building a house. So if you have protein, let's say that's like the lumber. If you have a pile of lumber, and that's representing protein in this analogy, if you just have a pile of lumber, does that mean you have a house? No, right? It's just a pile of lumber. So we need all the other things to go with the protein to actually build the muscle, to build endurance, all those things. So I like to think of proteins like the lumber, the building blocks. The carbohydrates are all the workers who actually are building that house. And then the fats are like all the different things, maybe the nuts and bolts to put everything together, the insulation around the house. I sort of like to use that analogy of it's not just one thing that's important. We need to look at all three of these things. We're not going to talk too much about vitamins and minerals, simply just to keep this a little bit more concise. And because those won't provide energy, those are still great for our body. But we're focusing mostly on just the food aspects of fueling and the energy aspects for the race and for training. All right. So one of the things that I'll mention for our talk today, we did include the numbers, but we're not going to focus on them. So we included them in the slides in case you wanted to jot these down. It might be helpful to maybe at one point sort of calculate this out for your own self, but it's not necessary. We're going to give you a lot of examples of how to actually implement this without having to count, without having to calculate things. This is just more optional. So with carbohydrates, we really want to be, again, focusing on those. So on a low moderate day, we need about 2 to 3 grams per pound a day. On a moderate high intensity day, so maybe these are your long runs, or maybe you're doing more of a tempo run that's taking a little bit more energy out of you, you might be looking at more of a 3 to 4.5 grams per day per pound. So this is really just your basic training throughout your running season. To put this into perspective a little bit, throughout this presentation, we just picked a 140-pound person to choose a few examples. So if we did the low moderate intensity, we'd be looking at 325 to almost 450 grams of carbs for that day. So to even break that down a little bit more, so it makes a little bit more sense in visualizing this, that's equivalent to 26 pieces of bread. So we're not saying to eat 26 pieces of bread, but just to sort of give you that visualization is you actually need a lot more carbs than what maybe you've heard of before. So throughout this, you'll see us really focusing on how can we get more carbs for that energy source. Right. Then for protein, estimations about 0.5 to 1 gram per pound a day. Spreading this throughout the day is going to be best. So I sort of like to keep it in mind, like meals should be 20 to 30 grams, snacks 10 to 15, and then you spread it evenly throughout the day and you're all set. You don't really have to calculate that out if you don't choose to. Finally, fat is more of like sort of whatever we still need to get those like energy, the calories in. So it should take about 25% of your daily caloric intake. Again, we'll give you examples as we go through. So don't feel like if you're losing us here, don't worry about it. This is a sample for just a training day, average training day, sort of that moderate intensity. So here's just a sample of breakfast, snack, lunch, snack, dinner, snack. I like to do everything in 3 meals and 3 snacks. You can always add in more snacks, but I wouldn't go under this as a runner. So you all can read that on the side, but I'm going to give you an easier way to even break this down. So we like to use the performance plate method. This is where you have your plate, you're filling your plate, and we're going to pretend like it's a pie chart. And there's different breakdowns for different intensities of your run or your race. So this is sort of your basic average go-to plate where you just break everything down into thirds. So you have 1/3 of your plate is filled with a carb source or grains, potatoes, oats, bread, pasta. 1/3 is filled with proteins and fats. I put these together because a lot of times we cook with fat with our protein, or sometimes meats have just a higher percentage of fat. So we sort of get that in right there. And then 1/3 of it is color. Color is usually fruits and vegetables, but it doesn't have to be. So sometimes we'll have color from like avocado, which is a fruit, but also it's a fat source. So these can intermingle. It's not a perfect system, but it's just to give you that broad idea if you're sort of not wanting to get too caught up in the numbers and just want to make sure you're getting enough in your body. So this is just a basic day. You could honestly go with this for light days, for heavy days. If you want, just keep with the thirds. If you choose to go a little, oh yeah, I put in some nice little foods there to show you sort of how the breakfast that we have here would split up and fit on that plate. So we have the oats, granola, honey are our carbs. We have the dried fruit and fresh fruit as our color. And then protein and fat is the eggs with cheese in it. So like I was saying, if you choose to do a little bit more, here's another option if you want to like divvy up your light training days for more heavy training days. And you'll also see us reference this heavy training plate a few times as we go through the presentation. Light training day, the only difference is half the plate is color. We cut down on some of those carbs. Heavy training day, we bumped up those carbs because like we were saying, that's one of your main sources of energy. If you're expending a lot of energy, we need a lot more carbs.
All right, so now we're going to look a little bit at what it might look like during the loading phase or pre-competition days. A lot of you maybe have heard of carbo loading. It's a pretty common topic. Basically, it just means intaking extra carbs 2 to 3 days and the day before the competition. Getting those extra carbs in your diet is just going to help you store up that muscle glycogen, which is the energy used mainly during the races. So the numbers wise, we recommend about 4.5 to 5.5 grams per pound. Again, this kind of equates to that heavy training plate, if that's easier. Half the plate's carbs, a little bit of color, some protein and fat in there. You might want to limit fat a little bit on these carbo loading days, just because you're going to get the extra calories from the carbohydrates itself, and having a lot of fat in the diet might not make as much room for those carbohydrates. For a 140-pound person, that 4.5 to 5.5 grams per pound would be about the 630 grams to 770 grams, just to kind of put that in perspective as well. The day of the competition, we always are going to promote having breakfast, even if it's something small. I know a lot of people aren't going to want to get up and have a huge breakfast right away, but it is really important that you try to get some of that energy in before the competition. We recommend quick, easy to digest carbs, and we'll talk more about those in the upcoming slides as well. But those are going to be things like white bread, fruit snacks, Gatorade, things that are just easy on the stomach, easy to digest, and give you that quick energy. Again, we're going to recommend limiting fat, fiber, and protein as you get closer to race time, just to keep down on that GI stress. As far as fluids go, follow your thirst cues. Definitely try to drink at least 1 glass of water, if not a few glasses of water before, but you also want to make sure you're not overhydrating and making yourself uncomfortable during the race. So really just following what your body's telling you when it comes to thirst.
I was just going to add a little bit too, with that thirst. The reason why we say follow your thirst cues is because there is sort of that old saying that once you're thirsty, you're actually already dehydrated. So in research, that's not the case. So they've actually shown a lot. That was sort of from a very old study. They've showed a lot more recently that actually following your thirst cues is adequate. So that's sort of why we say that. We don't have a specific of, having so many milliliters or ounces. That's usually pretty sufficient, especially leading up to the race.
Okay, so here's just a sample of what the days before when we're loading might look like. For breakfast, oats, dried fruit, maple syrup, and fruit juice, a snack of a banana and peanut butter. For lunch, a burrito with ground turkey and guacamole, refried beans, rice, and corn. Another snack of pretzels, hummus, and applesauce. For dinner, spaghetti, meatballs, tomato sauce, peas, and a dinner roll. And then another snack of frozen yogurt and a handful of berries. I think when you see it laid out like that, it definitely makes it seem a lot more manageable. We also recommend drinking 1 glass of water with each meal or snack. And then if we compare this to the heavy training day plates, you can kind of see how not everything fits perfectly in a category, and that's okay. Just try to focus on making sure a lot of our food is coming from carbohydrate sources, with a little bit of protein and fat and some color thrown in there as well. And then on the day of the race, if it's about 2 to 4 hours before, you might want to have a light breakfast, a couple pieces of toast with banana, honey, and peanut butter. But about an hour or less before the race, we really just want to focus on those quick, easy to digest carbs again. Gatorade, a couple handfuls of fruit snacks. And we always want to stress that you don't want to try this for the first time the day of the race. Try these tactics while you're training so that you know how your body is going to react when it comes to race day.
Yeah, and I was going to mention, Marissa sort of touched on it a little bit already, but with the breakfast items, especially on a race day, there's a lot of nerves, there's a lot of anxiety, like our stomachs may not feel that settled. We still emphasize, like, what can you get in? If you can't, this is ideal, but ideal doesn't always mean that's realistic. So we're giving you, again, that ideal sort of picture. But if you can't do that, think about for yourself, what can I do? If I'm not doing anything right now, can I add a handful of fruit snacks? That is going to give your body that energy. And when we're talking about the liver glycogen that fuels our brain to prevent the mental fatigue, that's coming actually from what we're eating right before that race, within like the hour or 2 hours beforehand. That's why we really emphasize, can we get something in? So just sort of think about that. You can always build a tolerance as you go along as well. So if this is something that, you haven't done in the past, it might be something to try out. Then like Marissa said, just making sure we're trying it out on those training days versus the race day.
Now we're going to move into talking about fueling during exercise. So if your competition, race, or training is going to be 1 to 2.5 hours in length, it's recommended that you try to get in 30 to 60 grams of easy to digest carbs every hour. So again, those are things like fruit snacks, candy, applesauce, Gatorade. Try to keep in mind that dry food options like pretzels might not be the best. They can leave a really drying feel in your mouth and maybe make you really thirsty and might not be the most pleasant experience while you're running. If your activity is longer than 2.5 hours or it's a little bit more intense, we recommend bumping that up to about 90 grams per hour of activity. As far as fluids go, shoot for about 13 to 27 ounces per hour. This is varied per person, how much you sweat and the intensity of the exercise. But basically that equates to about 1 plastic disposable water bottle or 1 20-ounce reusable water bottle, somewhere in there. Just be careful not to overhydrate again and just follow your thirst cues.
And two, I just was thinking of this, for the easy to digest carbs, another way to put that is just simple sugars. So if that makes a little bit more sense, and we have some examples coming up. And then with the fluids as well, Marissa was saying that it sort of differs based on that race as well. So like, and the temperature outside will also vary. So if it's a really hot day, your needs are going to be on the higher end. On a cooler day, it might be more on that lower end.
So just some samples of things that might work well to try while you're training first, and then implementing while you're in the race. Sports drinks like Gatorade, they offer some quick carbs as well as hydration. There's other sports gels, some are made by Gatorade, there's other brands out there as well. Fruit squeeze pouches that contain applesauce or other pureed fruits in them. Bananas are a popular one, and we've talked about it, a few handfuls of fruit snacks or candy throughout. Moving into the recovery phase, to make it a little simpler, we're going to break it down into 3 time frames. So there's 0 to 1 hour after the race or training, 2 to 3 hours after, and then 4+ hours after. So with those time frames in mind, during at least one of the time frames, you want to have a meal, and that's going to look like the heavy training plate day. Mostly carbs, a little bit of color, a little bit of protein and fat. And then in the remaining time frames, aim for a snack that has both protein and carbs in it. As far as numbers go for the carbs, for 24 hours after the race, you want to shoot for about 3.5 to 4.5 grams per pound per day. That's about 490 to 630 grams per day for a 140-pound athlete. And again, we have some samples coming up. So the meal might look something like this. Spaghetti and meatballs with garlic bread and a small side salad. Just a few snack options that contain both the protein and the carbohydrates. Cottage cheese and berries, bananas and peanut butter, hummus and pretzels. And then there are some products out there like Cliff Bars that have both the protein and carbohydrates all in one convenient snack for you.
And then with this as well, because we have that heavy training plate and your needs are actually that way for a good 24 hours, even after your race. So that means the rest of that next day, still stick with a heavy training plate, even if that day is a rest day, which it most likely will be if you had like a long run or after a race. You still want that heavy training plate because your body is recovering for at least 24 hours after. Sometimes your muscles are still repairing even after those 24 hours. So you want to make sure you're staying fueled to have a more quick and efficient recovery.
As far as fluids go for recovery, you want to try to replace 150% of the fluids lost. And with that, we just want to emphasize you need more than what you lost to help optimize your recovery. For an average person, that's going to be about 24 to 72 ounces for 1 hour of recovery. So about 2 plastic water bottles, anywhere up to 4 plastic water bottles, 1 to 3 Gatorades. And then the research also shows that a little bit of sodium helps to support better fluid replenishment after long exercise. And so that's kind of where the Gatorade comes in. It could help you better replenish your fluids. The best way to monitor your fluids is to monitor your urine. So this is a sample of a urine chart. If you're on the lighter end, you're probably doing good and you're pretty hydrated. If your urine's a little on the darker end, then you might want to up your hydration a little bit.
All right, so we're just going to sort of give an overview summary of just the main things to remember then, whether this is for the race day, but this can also translate into your normal training days as well. So beforehand, if you have 2 to 4 hours beforehand, I know a lot of times races are in the morning, so this may not be realistic, but if you do wake up a little bit earlier, go ahead and have that light breakfast. Focus on more carbs than fats and proteins, because carbs will be that energy source. The other ones will digest a little bit slower and just won't sit as well in your stomach. So this example that we had done was the 2 pieces of toast. We have a banana there. We have a little bit of peanut butter and some honey over the top. As you get closer to that race time or closer to that training session, we want to be having those quick, simple carbs, simple sugars. So this one is a fruit snack along with that Gatorade, because we want to be getting the electrolytes in, the hydration as well. During that race, we're having the Gatorades. Sometimes those races will have the little cups sitting out at those stations. Those stations are sort of measured out. I would really highly recommend using them. Sometimes it's easy just to go past them, but trying to utilize them, because it really will help your performance in a race. Otherwise, if you are running on your own through training, pack things. It's not always the easiest or most exciting to pack foods with you, but get a little thing that you can throw around your waist where you can pack some of those quick gels or applesauces, or like something where you can put some fluids, especially if you're going for longer than an hour. Finally, afterwards, we still want to focus on the carbohydrates. So again, that sort of heavy training plate, we want those carbohydrates, and protein is going to be important afterwards, as well as having consistent patterns of eating for the next 4 hours. That is what's going to help you recover the quickest. And a lot of times after workouts, you'll see a lot, they really emphasize the protein. Protein is definitely important. However, if you're not fueling with the carbs as well, sort of like what we said, that building that house, you can't rebuild and repair your body if we don't have the workers to do it. So really the general recommendations are anywhere you can do the heavy training plate, or a 3-to-1 ratio of carbs to protein. So if you have 20 grams of protein afterwards, we need 60 grams of carbs to go with that to really support recovery. That is going to be the quickest way to recover, so that you feel, not as sore 5 days after the race. Anytime that soreness is lasting more than a few days, it's a sign that maybe we didn't fuel as well as we could have earlier on. So just something to keep in mind. And like I said, it's one big meal you want to be having at one of those time frames that we mentioned. The other one still getting a snack in every 1 to 2 hours after that race. All right. I'm going to cover a few of these just nuances in running that I think is really important. And this might help too if anyone had questions about these. I wanted to make sure we covered them. A big one, and I know from my past experience as a cross-country runner in college, is the GI discomfort and the potential for diarrhea. So these are real things that can happen. And how do we find solutions for this? So one, GI discomfort is telling me that something before the race, it might not be optimal. However, sometimes it's not always food related. So just keep that in mind, because anxiety can also cause some GI distress. So figuring out how can I take care of like that anxiety, breathing techniques, really being ready for that race. And then if it is food related, that might mean we're having too much fiber. Sometimes that can cause GI discomfort. Maybe we're having too much fat or protein and it's slowing down our digestion. The other flip side of this, and it's tough because everyone's so individual. So these are just basic suggestions to try out and to see what works best for you. But sometimes there is some people who actually struggle with actually having too much of the simple carbs. And so if you notice like, hey, I'm not having protein, I'm not having fat, and I'm not having fiber, and I'm still having like diarrhea or like different GI like discomfort, you might actually be doing too much of the simple carbs. So then I'd say add a little bit of protein in with it. It'll slow down that digestion a little bit, which will actually be good if you're struggling with diarrhea. So sort of playing around, finding the best balance for you. Again, we gave those general recommendations, but everyone's going to have a different experience. So that's why it's really important to practice this during your training sessions, so you're not coming up with something new or experiencing something unusual during a race. All right. Second one is lack of appetite. So this is, we sort of mentioned already, especially in the morning, some people just aren't breakfast people. I just challenge you to, what can we get in? Maybe it's literally just drinking some Gatorade or drinking a glass of apple juice. That is going to be better than nothing. The other thing is, after races, sometimes people just don't have an appetite. Other people will be ravenous and they're so hungry because their body needs the energy. Some people just don't have an appetite. In those moments, you can't really just trust your own hunger cues and be like, oh, I'm not hungry, I don't need the energy. We have to be intentional as athletes to know that, hey, I just ran for an hour or 2 hours or whatever it was, and I need to keep that fueling plan. That's why we have those time frames. So you're eating every 1 to 2 hours after a training session or after a race, to really make sure you're getting the foods you need, even if that appetite isn't there. They've actually done studies on this where they gave elite athletes an all-you-can-eat buffet, and they tested to see, are they eating enough to replenish what they just worked off? And only 50% of the people actually ate enough from what they actually, like what they just burned off in their exercise. So it's just one of those things that tells you sometimes our hunger and fullness cues aren't always going to be the most accurate as runners or as athletes. Sometimes we do have to be intentional with these different food items. Iron deficiency anemia. This is a common one that can come up with runners. Again, everyone's individual. I would really recommend you talk to a doctor and get some lab tests done to see if this is something that you may be struggling with. If you are, this would be really important to work with a dietitian or a nutrition professional who knows how to support you through iron deficiency. There are a few different things that can help. If you're not getting enough carbohydrates, you will actually not absorb iron as well. There's also different kinds of iron. We have heme and non-heme. So iron is more readily absorbed in our body from like red meat sources versus fruits and vegetables. They just don't absorb as well. You can still get it from that. Again, it's just not as bioavailable. We can't absorb it that well. So there's a few different techniques you can do with that that don't have to just do with like supplementing. If you ever choose to supplement, just make sure you're meeting with your doctor on that. Injuries. So a big one, if you notice you are getting injuries constantly, you're getting shin splints, different things where it's sort of like overuse injuries or that sort of thing. It's not always related to food. So I'm not going to say it is like if you twist an ankle or things like that. Injuries aren't always related to food. However, if you have a pattern and you're noticing you're getting injuries more frequently than others, it could be a nutrition-related injury. So what I would just recommend is, usually that means we're not eating enough. If we're not eating enough, then your body is not going to be repairing itself enough. It's going to be breaking down a little bit more. You're going to be more prone to injury. Could also be some of the bone health if we're not getting enough calcium, potassium, some of those different minerals that really strengthen our bones. So not only increasing energy, but then that's why we have that color piece in that performance plate method visual, because the color is where you're going to get some of those vitamins and minerals that's going to help just your overall body and bone health. Another one with females that I think it's really important to note is females who are still having, I guess, like under their like premenopausal, so before they hit menopause, if you're not getting a period every month, that's a sign that something's not going right in our body. Of course, if you're on birth control or something like that, that'll change it. But if you're not and you're not getting a period every month, a lot of times in the athletic field and with runners, it's sort of deemed as, oh, that's totally normal. You're an athlete. It's okay that you're not getting your period. That is not the case. So if that is something you're struggling with, please reach out to somebody who can help you, because that is telling me that you're not getting enough energy for your body. All right. Another, as we finish up these last two, then we'll get to some questions. Lose weight, run faster. This is a big one. And I actually saw this working with athletes in the past, where a coach had recommended that all the runners lose 5 pounds because it's going to help their performance. I just really would put caution with this, because losing weight, if your body is not meant to lose that weight, will not lead to you running faster. Because if you're not fueling your body enough, and that's why you're losing weight, your performance is actually going to decline. I like to think of it as we all have different heights, and we sort of think that's pretty normal, right? There's people who are 5 foot, there are people that are 6 foot or higher or lower, and that's pretty normal. We accept that in our society. The same is true with weight. We just don't accept it as much. We all have different weights as well. So when we try to force ourselves to fit a certain norm that our body's not meant to fit, we're actually going to see performance decline. I like to think too, there is no one runner's body. Every body can have a runner's body. It simply means that you go out and run. There's no specific, there's no perfect. Everyone's going to be individual. So keeping that in mind, if we're purposely trying to lose weight, restricting calories, it's actually going to harm some of our performance. So I like to really just focus on how can I better my performance and not focus so much on the weight, because your body will do whatever it needs to when it comes, if we're just fueling for performance. And then the very last one, because this is a common one too that I see, is should I eat less on rest days? This can go one of two ways. Usually rest days are after a pretty, like your long run or something like that. As we mentioned before, your body's recovering for a good 24 hours after. So I wouldn't necessarily eat less. I would, if not, you might eat a little bit more carbs. Otherwise, just keep everything the same as you've been doing, so your body recovers and repairs for your next run. If anything, you could do the lighter training day plate, where you're increasing the color, so the fruits and vegetables or other colorful items, and decreasing carbs slightly if you're just taking sort of a few weeks off of running to let your body recover after a big race. Maybe we do that, but you don't have to. You could easily stay at that thirds, the plate with all the thirds, 1/3 color, 1/3 carbs, 1/3 protein and fat, and you would be completely fine, and your body would be restoring itself very nicely. So then, just wrapping up, we'll have a bit of time as well for some questions. So if anyone does have questions, I believe they'll go through the chat. Also, we have our contact information here. If you ever had further questions that you wanted to reach out to either of us, we have our emails attached, and we'd be more than happy to help out with those.
Well, great. Thank you guys for doing that for us tonight. We did have one question so far. Please put your questions in the chat, and we'll get them answered for you. First one's from Gary. Is iron availability in plant-based meat the same as bovine or fowl or fish meat?
Yeah, so no. If it's plant-based, it generally, and I guess I would have to really look into like all the specifics, but generally those will not be as bioavailable. A lot of it has to do with just there's some synergy. So when all the things are combined in meats, it just helps our body absorb it. And so yeah, if it's plant-based, even if it's the plant-based meat, it still wouldn't absorb as well. That does not mean you can't get enough iron from being a vegetarian or something like that. You just have to be a little bit more intentional with what you're choosing to eat. So combining different things, making sure you're getting enough of those items, because if we know our body doesn't absorb it as well, you might just want to eat a little bit more of it if you do struggle with low iron. Not everyone does though. So that's something where you might just want to check in with a doctor.
What's your theory on practicing what you eat before you run? I mean, over the years of running, I know I've practiced what I'm going to be using on race day, just to make sure I don't have the sensitivity of foods, I guess, during race day. What's your thoughts on that?
I would 100% do that. I wouldn't introduce anything new on a race day, because you're already not going to be able to 100% replicate a race day in your training, because there's just more anxiety, there's more stress, there's all the things. So I would completely plan out, because if you're training for a half marathon or if you're training for a marathon, generally you have those long runs throughout that training plan. So I would use those as sort of a tester, like, how do these foods do? Like, how do I feel with them? How do they sit with me in my body? I would definitely map that out, test it out, and then just replicate what works for you on a race day. Because like I said, you're already going to have a little bit more probably GI distress with anxiety or stress. So you want to try to manage as much as possible.
What are there any foods that are more like anti-inflammatory, things that could take care of some of the inflammations that we do build up in our bodies as we train?
Yeah, great question. So this is one, we actually did have a slide and we chose to we weren't sure if that would get a little bit too complicated for people. But one of them that's out there that's actually really well studied is tart cherry juice. So if you've ever heard of the cherry Bondi, I believe, or cherry Bundy it is, that's a pretty popular one, but you don't have to get that brand name. You can just get any at the store. That one is a very high anti-inflammatory content, and it has shown to actually decrease inflammation, which is really best to be used maybe a little bit later in your training. So in the beginning, when you're first starting out your training plan, you want your body to adapt. So it's not bad to have the inflammation. Inflammation's not bad. If we have it, our body can adapt and we sort of build that base. As we get later on in that training plan and closer to race time, then you want to be implementing sort of a tart cherry juice or other anti-inflammatory items. So anything that's high in antioxidants, which will be a lot of those fruits and vegetables, any of those you want to start implementing a little bit more, because it'll decrease the inflammation, decrease recovery time. And at that point, you don't need your body to be adapting. You don't need it to be building a base anymore, because you already have it. So it's better for later on. That way you're recovering well. You're not feeling sore for a race day. And then even after that race day, you want to be having the tart cherry juice or other items a few days after, and you'll actually see that your muscle soreness will decline more quickly than it usually would.
Great, thank you. Any other questions anybody has? You guys have been awfully quiet tonight that are on. Or they can't type fast, I'm not sure. Well, you do have their information, which is over on the slide here. So if you do have any other questions that do pop up as you're training, please reach out to them. I do appreciate Kirsten and Marissa to be here tonight. Thank you again for coming on tonight and educating us a little bit more on what we need to put in our bodies as we train. Our next Pints and Pointers will be Wednesday, February 15th, again, 6 o'clock, right back here, virtual land here. Topic is life and balance while training. This is going to be with Paul and Carrie Miller, who are owners of On Pace, who also have, I think, 6 kids. And they keep up their training and they run a million races. I think a lot of you probably know them. But they are going to be teaching us the best practices on how you can balance your life and training. The discussion will challenge you to examine how you can better balance your life and get the most out of your training. And I guarantee Paul and Carrie will definitely challenge you, since they do have 6 kids and have been challenged in themselves and how they've gotten around it to train at a top level. So come on back Wednesday, February 15th. Again, thank you to our speakers again. And for everybody out there, thank you for coming tonight, and hope to see you again on February 15th. All right, thank you. Good night, everyone.